Our text in Matthew chapter 26 that Colton read for us gives us the basis for our lesson this evening. Of a man we know well, a man that we know as certain things. This man, Judas. I want to look at Judas this evening and to understand more about him. We know what he did. We know what he did was despicable. We know at least maybe in part why he did it. But I want to look at Judas to understand this man some more. To understand, to give us the knowledge of this man, first of all, and what he did. It was already known in the foreknowledge of God that Jesus would be delivered into the hands of his enemies. It's told to us in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, and verses 22 and 23. Peter says, "You men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God unto you by mighty works and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, even as ye yourselves know. Him, being delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye by the hand of lawless men did crucify and slay." One of the great Christian paradoxes of a Christian life is this. Jesus' death occurred as a result of a plan and foreknowledge of God. But it was the free and sinful acts of humans that executed that plan. The Bible affirms to us the sovereignty of God. It affirms to us both the divine sovereignty and human choice, without explaining how the two can work together without conflict. In Genesis chapter 45 and verse 5, we have kind of an example of there as well. Genesis 45 and verse 45, this is a story of Joseph in part here. In verse 5, it says, "And be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life." We know what Joseph's brothers did to him, sold him to slavery, and ended up in Egypt, ended up becoming a very wealthy man, a very well-respected man. But his brothers didn't know anything about this. And when they come before him, he recognizes them. They don't recognize him. The story goes on. Don't be angry with yourselves. Don't grieve yourselves. This was God's plan all along. It was in accordance with God's preordained purpose that Jesus, was to be delivered into their power. J.W. McGarvey's comments there in his commentary in Acts. He was delivered, surrendered, meaning there, or given over to. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2, Peter says there, "Foreordained before the foundation of the world." It was already prophesied that Jesus would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah chapter 11 and verse 10 beginning. "And I took my staff, beauty, and I cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant which I had made with all the peoples, and was broken in that day. And thus the poor of the flock that gave heed unto me knew that it was the word of Jehovah. And I said unto them, If ye think good, give me hire, if not, forbear. So they weighed for my hire 30 pieces of silver. And Jehovah said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, the goodly price that I was prized at by them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them unto the potter in the house of Jehovah." Symbolizing here in Zechariah the severance of his relationship with them. He says there, all the peoples. breaking this covenant with all the nations, he said God's hand of restraint had been removed. This goodly price that he mentions there in verse 13. And it's thought to some suggestion there that may be sarcastic in nature in saying that. But this goodly price in the temple was an act of desecration. Matthew used some of the wording of Zechariah here in reference to Judas. But it was Jeremiah's prophecy in chapter 32, verses 6 through 43, that was fulfilled. Matthew combined these two prophecies by Zechariah and Jeremiah in what we recorded there. So let's look here. What is this character of Judas? What kind of man was he? The name Judas is often used synonymously with a traitor. And still today, you don't hear of somebody named Judas, do you? Just as you don't hear somebody named Jezebel. There's a reason for that. Because of this, we associate him as a traitor, but he was much more than that as we go on to see. Just what kind of person was the one who was fitted into God's plan that to be a friend of Christ and betray the Son of God? Well, God often uses vile people, corrupt people, to carry out his divine plans. Why, for absolute certainty, why did Judas betray Jesus? And we don't know for sure of why. Some suggest he did it as in Mark chapter 14, verses 10 and 11, after being convinced that Jesus really was going to die. In verses 3 through 9 there of Mark chapter 14. Some suggest, as Matthew talks about in the text there, Matthew chapter 26, that he did it for money, verses 14 and 16. Or that he did it to help Jesus fulfill his purpose of dying. This statement, though, is at odds with Jesus' words, which are found in Mark chapter 14 and verse 21. But a better question might be to ask, why did Judas betray Jesus? A better question that we might ask and easier to answer as well is what Judas is. What is Judas? What is he betrayed? What is he since he betrayed the Son of God? God uses, as we said, corrupt and vile people to accomplish his purpose. He used Pharaoh. In Romans chapter 9 and verse 17, there it says, "For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, for this very purpose did I raise thee up, that I might show in thee my power, and that my name might be published abroad in all the earth." We know what kind of man Pharaoh was. God used him. God used Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, a man that was corrupt. But he used him for a purpose, to proclaim his name and his power in all the earth, so that the one true God would be known. Pharaohs often associated themselves with gods. Pharaohs considered here, the Pharaoh you're talking about here, considered himself to be the epitome of Ra, which is the sun god of Egypt. God used Judas, a corrupt man, to accomplish his purpose. What Judas betrayed is easier to answer. He betrayed Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. But his absence at the trial, when witnesses were sought, might seem to refute this. He betrayed how Jesus could be arrested privately in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Jesus told them, you could have come at any time. When the mob came after he had finished praying in the garden there, he said, you could have come any time. I was with you other times. You could have come privately. You didn't have to come to this moment now. He did this because at Gethsemane, by singling him out with a kiss at night. God often works and works through idolatrous, evil nations to punish his people. Such a person was even chosen to be one of his disciples. He was a traitor, yes. He was selfish. He was greedy. He was envious. He was covetous. This was Judas. John chapter 12 and verse 3 beginning there. Mary therefore took a pound of ointment of pure nard, very precious, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples that should betray him, saith, why was not this ointment sold for 300 shillings and given to the poor? Now this he said, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and having the bag took away what was put therein. Jesus therefore said, suffer her to keep it against the day of my burying. For the poor you have always with you, but me you have not always. This pure ointment, this of pure nard, was kept in an alabaster jar. This is recorded for us in the synoptic gospels. Attending to the feet of guests was a task of servants. So Mary's actions here showed her humility and her devotion. And this is very, very significant to understand and to know that Mary, being a Jewish woman, it was women rarely unbound their hair in public. And she did so to wipe the feet of Jesus in public. There are many people today often of the same character as Judas, though. Often given a pretense of goodwill with merely to hide their evil character and to gain for their own selfish, greedy desires. Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Judas had a love of money. He was a thief. There are, throughout generations, there have been people that exploit the poor, the unfortunate, for the purpose of their own profit. Judas wasn't concerned with the poor. He was a thief. He was an embezzler. He wanted the funds for his own use. And his covetousness for money proved to be his downfall. The scriptures tell us he was pierced through with many sorrows. Not only was he selfish and greedy and covetous, he was a hypocrite. A hypocrite of the worst type. He used a sign of sacred friendship and trust to carry out his shameful, deceitful act of betrayal. Matthew 26, verses 14 and 16 again. It says, then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me? I will deliver him unto you. And they weighed unto him 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought opportunity to deliver him unto them. Judas, these 30 pieces of silver was an amount equal to about 120 days' wages. Now remember what he said back in John about this ointment that Mary wiped and anointed the feet of Jesus with. So he says there, remember, why wasn't this ointment sold for 300 shillings? And now 30 pieces of silver. About 1/3 of the value of Mary's gift, that ointment. Look over here with me for just a minute in Matthew 27. Matthew 27 and verses 9 and 10. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was priced, to whom certain of the children of Israel did price. And they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord appointed me. Matthew appeals to the Old Testament and blends themes from Zechariah chapter 11 and then in Jeremiah chapter 32. The first describes Israel's rejection of the Messiah, the low estimation they had of him, and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. The second assures that Israel will be restored after its desolation by the Babylonians. Judas betrayed a friend. Judas betrayed his master for money. Mark chapter 14, verse 43. And straightway, while he yet spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a multitude with swords and staves, and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he that betrayed him had given him a token, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that is, he, take him and lead him away safely. And when he was come, straightway he came to him and saith, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they laid hands on him and took him. This word that Mark uses here, whomsoever I shall kiss, the Greek word kataphaleo means, the Greek means to kiss much, to kiss again and again. It's an emphatic verb form that is used to suggest that mere than just a casual fervor or affection. To address Jesus as Rabbi in a mocking respect. Playing the part of a loyal disciple, greeting his teacher as master, as Rabbi, then turning him over to that mob. And addressing Jesus in that way, teacher or rabbi or master, intensified the act of mocking devotion, only added to his guilt. This kiss, a token of betrayal. A kiss, usually, that is another Greek word for it. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 14, Peter says there, salute one another with a kiss of love. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 20 uses the word there, salute one another with a holy kiss. It's a different Greek word. That's philema. That was a kiss was an expression of love and respect and friendship. Judas was anything but a friend of Jesus. Later on in Matthew, in chapter 26 and verse 47, and while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves, the chief priests and elders and the people. Now he that betrayed him shall give him a sign, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that is he, take him. And straightway he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, Friend, do that for which thou art come. And they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. By looking at Judas and saying, Friend, an implication there of a loving rebuke. Why are you here? Do what you have come to do. In Jesus' statement of friend, addressing his friend, there is love. There is peace. The struggle that Jesus had has been fought out in prayer with his Father. This word friend, also used in chapter 20 and verse 13 and chapter 22 and verse 12 in the Greek, emphasizes, the emphasis on the word is on the fact that Judas was a fellow member of the band of disciples. He was a comrade. He was a mate. He was a partaker. And in that, the meaning there of friend in the Greek, as the extended definition, my good friend. Not that Jesus did not know with what intention Judas kissed him when he addressed him as friend, but to make Judas fully aware of his abominable and deplorable acts of treachery. This was done to make Judas aware of his self-condemnation by using a holy, sacred act to commit such a vile deed. He did not come as an open enemy, but he disguised himself. He came as a disguised enemy under the cloak of friendship to betray the Lord. It is hardly possible to imagine anyone more vicious and wicked than one who would betray a friend for personal gains or money. Only a character, or such a vicious character as Judas, could betray a friend through such hypocrisy as a kiss. People in business, people in politics are ready to betray friends for personal gain and profit. Sadly, some brethren exploit their friendships for personal gains as well and profit. If they cannot gain their desires, or if they have by friendship, they readily turn against their friends. It is sad when people are not willing to stand for one another, for the sake of honor, for the sake of truth, for the sake of right principles. Some people are always willing for others to take the blame for their misdeeds. Judas was a hypocrite of the worst kind. Not only that, he was a coward. Matthew chapter 27, and let's read the first 5 verses here. Matthew chapter 27. Now when morning was come, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him up to Pilate the governor. Then Judas, who betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood. But they said, what is it to us? See thou to it. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the sanctuary and departed, and he went away and hanged himself. When he saw that he was condemned, there was no concern over the crime against Christ for which they were charging him with, or against heaven. Not concerned over Christ and his suffering was being subjected to because of his crime. Verse 3 says he repented himself. What that word means is it indicates remorse without any apparent commitment of himself to God. The change of mind that should have taken place, that takes place when one repents, was toward the money which he now loathed. He did not repent of his sin because of his own condemnation. It says he repented himself. And what the word means here, it's a different word than repent that you can find in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, chapter 3 and verse 19. It's a different Greek word. The word here, meaning repented himself, is translated, indicates not a sorrow for sin that leads to a change of mind or action, but a regret as being caught, a remorse that leads to despair. So he regretted that his betrayal came out. He didn't regret doing it. He regretted that he got caught. And Jesus called him out. Deuteronomy chapter 27 and verse 25, under the old law that he talks about here, that Judas talks about. He says, I have betrayed innocent blood. I have sinned, and that I have betrayed innocent blood. Betraying innocent blood was such a heinous offense that it resulted in a divine curse under the old law. Doesn't mean he had sorrow over sin that would lead him to salvation. Was merely changing from his selfish satisfaction from personal profit to fear of its consequences. It was not a concern for the suffering Christ, but that he found himself condemned. He hanged himself. A weak, cowardly man. He didn't have the courage to correct his life. So we ended it. Verse 4 in Matthew 27. I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See thou to it. The reaction of the chief priests and the elders shows here that they realized that Jesus was innocent. What is that to us? Even with the ones whom he conspired, that Judas conspired with. Did not use him or had no respect for him. They only banded together for evil, an evil act for which they were drawn together. People who have no right principle draw together. They have no principle at all to hold them together in the face of difficulty. In the church, unless people are drawn together by the sacred principles of the gospel, they will not preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 3. Being prompted by carnal desires and principles, they're going to be filled with envy, with strife and division. Paul says to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, "For ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you jealousy and strife, are you not carnal, and do you not walk after the manner of men?" Paul states here just simply that they're behaving like humans, following human masters. And one of the most stinging indictments that a Christian or a believer can hear: you're behaving like a human and like human masters and humans. Phrase is often an idiom for living like a slave. Walking, in a sense, they're in according to man, not to God. Verse 4 of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 4 shows that when he says this, of what some are saying. Because he says there, some say, "I am of Paul, I am of Apollos." But who were they? They were men. They were walking after the accordances of men. Judas was a weak and cowardly man who didn't have the courage to face the consequences of his actions. So what are some examples or some lessons that we can learn from Judas today? First of all, God did not make him do evil, nor did God restrain him. So I ask and look at this and say, if this was all foreordained, this is all in the knowledge of God, if this was the plan of God, did God arbitrarily make Judas commit the act? No, he did not. Go over here in the book of John, the Gospel of John, with me for a moment. John chapter 13. John chapter 13 and verse 21. When Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in the spirit, and testified and said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, one of you shall betray me." The disciples looked on one another, doubting of whom he spake. There was one at the table reclining in Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore beckoned with him and saith unto him, "Tell us who it is of whom he speaketh." He, leaning back as he was in Jesus' breast, saith unto him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus therefore answereth, "He it is for whom I shall dip the sop and give it to him." So when he had dipped the sop, he taketh and giveth to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And after the sop, then entered Satan into him. Jesus therefore saith unto him, "What thou doest, do quickly." God did not intervene in Judas's life and make him do evil. He didn't make him betray the Lord, but he did not restrain him either. Jesus did not intervene. Jesus had merely foretold or predicted what Judas was going to do. He allowed Judas to carry out his evil desires. Jesus used no power, used no force or influence to cause him to perform this evil. There in John chapter 13, this is Jesus is troubled. Parallels the emotions of David, who expressed anguish over the betrayal of his close friend in Psalm 55. The one who Jesus loved the one who is at the Father's side, the one that Jesus loved, is often identified as John. Echoing just a description of himself. Chapter 1, verse 18, who is at the Father's side. On a human level, Jesus' action of giving bread to Judas constituted an indication of friendship, as well as a final appeal to Judas that Judas rejected. The deed has already been prophesied. It has already been perpetuated in his heart. Verse 27 there of John 13, Satan entered his heart. He was prompted by Satan's influence to betray the Lord. But neither did Jesus prevent him from doing this wrong. Because it ends there in verse 27, what thou doest, do quickly. Jesus gave him no occasion to stumble. Judas had every opportunity to benefit from Christ's teaching and change his evil nature. Jesus did not beg. He did not plead with him. He did not compromise or flatter him to refrain from doing this evil. Judas made his own choice to betray the Lord. Many are so fearful of what ungodly people and ungodly members may do that many times they pamper them to avoid any trouble. They are more afraid of offending the guilty than they are of the disturbance and the harm he is creating by his ungodly deeds and his ungodly life. The lesson from Judas and from this, that we should not fear the sinner, but rather bring his case to its ultimate conclusion. Our society is reaping the terrible fruit of pampering to the lawless and burdening those abiding by the laws. And this, I fear, too, is happening in many churches. Or they may not be a Judas to that extreme. Those who are teaching error are tolerated, are pampered for fear of causing a disturbance or making trouble. Judas was a troublemaker. He was a traitor, yes. But he was so much more. So much more that led him to betray the Lord. What are we willing to betray the Lord for? Well, it may not be 30 pieces of silver. It can be sin. Being tolerant of sin. So the question is asked in the Gospels, what shall we give in exchange for our soul? In exchange for his soul, Judas took 30 pieces of silver. His choice. That was his price. What is ours? What is our price for our soul? I'm here to tell you that it is priceless. Your soul is more valuable than anything upon this earth that ever was, that ever is, and that will ever be. Don't exchange it for something that is momentary. Because it's not worth it. Don't be a Judas and betray the Lord. If you're here this evening and not a child of God, you must know that the Lord loves you. He wants you to be his child, to be his disciple. He is pleading with you to come to him in obedience, to put Christ on in baptism. We talked about opportunities this morning. This is your opportunity to be obedient to the Lord. Or as an erring child of God, there's sin in your life that you need to repent of. This opportunity is for you as well. Take it. The sad reality is, if you do not take this opportunity now to be obedient to the Lord, you may not have another one. Jesus is pleading. Come to him. Obey him. If we can help you and encourage you to do so, why not come now while we stand and while we sing?